Good day. Today is Monday, 14th April 2025. The situation with the tariff war, or economic war perhaps more accurately, between China and the United States remains unresolved. We're having contradictory statements from the president and his officials as to what exactly it is that they're doing with respect to China. There's still an atmosphere of nervousness in the financial markets, though for the moment the situation is a bit calmer than it was last week. And in the meantime, the two major conflicts, the two major military political conflicts, the one in Ukraine and the other in the Middle East, grind on. Now, over the last 24 hours, we've had various statements from US officials and from the president himself about the situation in the conflict, the trade conflict with China. I think trade conflict is not the right word. We're looking at economic blockades, certainly by China against the United States, an economic blockade by the United States against China, though one in which the president himself punched a hole over the weekend when he exempted a whole raft of electronic goods from the higher sanctions, the sanctions above 20% that he has levied on all other goods from China. Anyway, the rhetoric from Beijing is united and consistent. It is one of defiance. The Financial Times, for example, has visited various businesses and met with various business leaders in the southern Chinese city of Shenzhen. Shenzhen, for the record, is a major epicenter of China's electronics industry. I understand that Shenzhen and Hangzhou are the two leading places for developments in electronics and AI and computer science and all that. Hangzhou is in central China, closer to the sea, in the general area of Shanghai, though of course China is an enormous country and I don't want to give the impression that Shanghai and Hangzhou are actually close to each other. But anyway, the Financial Times went to Shenzhen and met with various business people there, and it found that they are indeed severely pressed by the economic pressure from the United States. Their businesses are indeed affected by this pressure, but they are apparently united in defiance. They are taking the same line that their government is, that China is not at fault in this crisis, that it is not true that China has cheated the United States. They all speak of the hard work and work that they all did in building up their businesses. They seem infuriated and angered by the criticisms of what they have done that is being made in the United States. And they point out correctly that they have very deep financial reserves. China has extremely deep financial reserves. The government may have borrowed heavily, but China has enormous reserves in terms of funds that Chinese citizens have on deposit in Chinese banks. The country overall is solvent and is not short of money, and they seem confident that they will be able over time to ride this through, and they expect that the United States eventually will bend. That seems to be the mood in China. In the United States it is more discordant, and as I said, there's been contradictory things said by various US officials. Now, one US official, and I can't remember which one it was, said that there are now soft talks between China and the United States about how to unwind this trade war. Now, by soft talks, I understand that I understand him to mean talks held indirectly and at a relatively low level. In other words, these are middle rank officials in the various governments, and they're exchanging messages, and they're doing so probably mostly through intermediaries. But at least some kind of contact and some sort of discussion does seem to be underway, though it doesn't seem to be leading in any particular direction, at least not for the moment. But against that, contrary to the initial suggestions that maybe the decision to relax tariffs on certain goods, principally made in China, over the weekend, might be a sign that the United States, that the president is preparing to moderate his stance against China. We're now getting reports that the United States does indeed intend to impose more tariffs, maybe on semiconductors next week, as early as next week, that the relaxations of the existing tariffs might be only temporary. The talk in Washington from the administration appears for the moment to be every bit as defiant as the talk in Beijing. Now, this is where I come back to the point that I've been making in several programs now. The president and his officials need to decide what it is that exactly that they are trying to do at this particular point in time. Are they seeking to rebuild American industry and manufacturing through a policy of protection, or are they waging an economic war against China? Now, I say that, many will say that the two objectives are not incompatible with each other, that they are complementary, that because China is the country that exports most to the United States and whose trade practices and industrial practices supposedly have been the most damaging to the United States, that waging an economic war against China is the correct way to regenerate and rebuild American industry. I do not agree with this view. I think if one goes down the path of economic war, then like every other war, it becomes no longer a question of whether your objective is to rebuild your own industries. The question becomes one of gaining some kind of victory over the other side in that economic war. I myself believe that China, in a prolonged economic war with the United States, has many advantages and, for what it's worth, is more likely to come out the winner, though at some cost to itself. But even if I'm wrong about that, and I don't believe I am, by the way, but even if I am wrong about that, even if over time the United States prevails in this conflict, there will be very significant costs, and I'm not sure that they're costs that the United States wants to incur. I have recently read, for example, that around 80% of iPhones sold in the United States are made in China. It would be all but impossible to replace all of those Chinese-made iPhones with iPhones made in other places very quickly. Apparently, a disproportionate number of iPhones produced in the world are made in China. Moreover, it seems that the iPhone is far and away the most popular smartphone in the United States. So, at the very least, if this policy is persisted in, we will either see shortages of iPhones in the United States, attendant with very high prices for iPhones, or alternatively, the US government itself is going to have to intervene in some form, perhaps by restricting sales of iPhones, perhaps by subsidizing the cost of iPhones, perhaps by taking measures to accelerate production of iPhones in the United States, though that too will take time. In every one of these cases, there would be significant economic and financial costs, and if the United States is forced to use government action to support key industries and key consumers whilst this economic war is playing out, well, that will affect the budget deficit. That will probably draw in more goods from abroad. It might, in the long term, create further imbalances in the US economy, and it could, in turn, undermine the entire project of reindustrialization in the United States, or so at least it seems to me. And you can say the same about all kinds of other products as well. I believe air conditioning systems, for example, sold in the United States are almost entirely made in China. Electric fans, for what it's worth, appear to be mostly made in China. And of course, China has a virtual monopoly on sales of rare earths. The United States has been talking for something like a decade about developing its own alternatives to China's rare earths monopoly. Nothing very much seems to have been done. To be clear, these so-called rare earths, geologically speaking, are not particularly rare. The difficulty lies in processing. That is an extremely complex and expensive process. Again, the United States certainly has the technological abilities to do it, but again, almost certainly that will take time, and in the meantime, the United States will be short of these rare earths. And I understand that large sectors of the US economy need these rare earths, and indeed parts of the military economy need these rare earths too. For example, there may be problems continuing large-scale production of the F-35 stealth fighter jets if supplies of rare earths from China stop. To repeat again, the United States can find ways round. It may take, however, several years. It will cost a lot of money at a time when the United States is trying to cut its budget deficit rather than increase it. The whole exercise, to me, looks self-defeating. So those are the costs of an economic war. They are not the same as taking steps to protect domestic industries by raising tariffs to rational heights, maybe the 10% flat tariff that the president has already imposed, with higher tariffs perhaps to protect specific sectors of the American economy, like the 25% tariff on imported motor vehicles. I am not suggesting here that this is the right way. I am not advocating for tariffs. I do not have the level of economic knowledge to be able to assess the consequences or to make long-term judgments about this. But if the president and his officials believe that protection is the way to rebuild the industrial structure of the United States, to bring manufacturing, low and middle level manufacturing, back to the United States, then that is something quite different from the kind of economic war against one particular country, namely China, that the United States, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, has now drifted into. So, there we are. That's what I'm going to say about the tariff situation today. I am going to make a guess, and it is purely a guess, though an informed guess, that this policy is unsustainable, that at some point over the next few weeks and few months, as prices of certain goods start to rise in the United States, key consumer goods start to rise in the United States, as consumer goods shortages in the United States begin to grow, there will start to be disaffection within the United States itself. There will start to be complaints, more complaints. There will also be, by the way, attempts to reroute exports to the United States of Chinese-made goods, even from places like Europe, which could defeat the entire exercise. Just saying. And, well, one way or the other, pressure in the financial markets from public opinion to change course will grow until eventually it becomes overwhelming and the president and his officials are obliged to change course and to back down. Again, I don't think it is in their interests for that to happen, and for that reason I hope that they will take the approach of using these so-called soft talks to set the condition for hard, direct talks, that they will start to do what I suggested in my program yesterday, which is lift all of the reciprocal tariffs, including the ones on China. There's no reason why China should be exempted from the 10% tariff, and I suppose if the president insists on his 10% fentanyl tariff on top of that, strange though that seems to me to be, well, if he insists on that, I don't suppose it will do existential damage. But he can then, after taking that approach, perhaps begin proper trade talks with China. He can have his summit meeting with Xi Jinping, and maybe we can take this thing forward and do so in a more structured and more coherent way, leading to some kind of outcome, some kind of positive outcome. The alternative is not only growing unrest in the United States and in other places, and greater tension and stress in the global economy, but inevitably a steady intensification of hostility towards China, of hostility by China towards the United States, and in the United States against China, and visceral feelings in the United States against China are already, in my opinion, dangerously high. There's already talk about transferring US military forces from Europe to confront the challenge from China. There's alarm about the size of the Chinese military buildup. I have to say, going back to that article in Bloomberg, going back to all those discussions that were taking place in Moscow, about which I was informed a couple of days ago, about how some people in Moscow are seeing these tariffs that the United States has imposed as basically a dress rehearsal for conditions of war, of armed conflict between China and the United States. I worry that even if that is not the intention, that will become what this crisis eventually leads to. And we could find ourselves in an armed conflict in the Pacific between China and the United States, which I believe that neither President Xi Jinping of China nor President Donald Trump of the United States actually want. Such a conflict would, of course, be an appalling disaster at the very least, and an existential crisis for all humanity if things really do begin to get completely out of control. So that is something which I think we should all strive to avoid. Anyway, that's one thing I will say. Now, I will just comment on some of the things that have been said about China's position. Let me repeat first again that because China is the world's biggest manufacturer, it can replace, has the means to replace all finished goods in China itself. They are not going to run out of smartphones or computers or garments or all of the other things that we've been talking about there. They do buy some goods from the United States, finished goods. They buy aircraft engines, for example, but it will take some time before the disappearance of those goods exported by the United States starts to get noticed. And China is already very advanced in developing its own civil aircraft engines. And so is Russia, by the way. And well, one can imagine how investment and resources, both in Chinese and potentially also Russian projects, could be stepped up from this point by the Chinese authorities, who have the means and the resources to do that, ending that problem of civil aircraft engine shortages perhaps more quickly than some people in the United States anticipated. If we're talking about raw materials, about oil, coal, lithium, food, wheat, soybeans, and those sort of things, China can import all of them from alternative suppliers who have not engaged China in a trade war. First and foremost, Russia, but also China's other fellow BRIC states, Brazil, and various other countries around the world also. So, the Chinese, or so it seems to me, in an economic war, are better positioned than the United States to survive and win it. There is something else, and it's a point that has been made. I'm not sure that I entirely buy these arguments or these statistics, but it's been pointed out that trade, exports, Chinese exports to the United States in any 1 year now account for, trade accounts for really small proportion of GDP. 13% of total exports, Chinese exports, go to the United States. I've seen figures that foreign trade now accounts for, perhaps 4.5% of GDP, 5% of GDP. Others put it lower, others put it higher. And it's been suggested that because the Chinese economy grows at a rate of 5% a year, at least that's the official Chinese government's figure, that China can make up the difference from this trade war in a single year simply by continuing its growth. Well, I'm not going to go down this particular line, though I see it being reported quite widely. I suspect that a trade war will have an impact on Chinese GDP growth. It will lower Chinese GDP growth, and I doubt that things can be sorted out quite so quickly, that all China needs to do is to simply go on growing, as if that was in itself a simple thing to do, and that will make up all the difference. But to repeat again, I do believe the Chinese are in a stronger position to absorb this challenge than many people in the United States still seem to understand. And, well, there are sectors where the United States still claims technological leadership. AI, the very advanced, highly advanced chips, for example. But given the scale of Chinese industry, I have no doubt at all that the Chinese will be able to make up the difference there in a relatively short time. Shorter, I suspect, than many people in the United States expect or imagine. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation today. This clearly has a while to play out, and we don't know where it's all going, but for the moment it does seem that the situation remains these two countries, China and the United States, remain at loggerheads with each other, with neither showing willingness for the moment to ease off or back down. So let's turn instead to the two great geopolitical conflicts. Now, I'm going to start again with Ukraine, and I'm going to start with the military situation briefly. Now, I say that there's been some really quite extraordinary news from one part of the battlefronts, which is, strangely enough, is Kursk region. The Russians have now pushed the Ukrainians out of almost all of Kursk region. The village of Guyevo fell about 3 days ago. The Russian chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, says that around 430 Ukrainian soldiers were taken prisoner. He didn't say that it was all at Guyevo, and his words were vague, but for the record, I suspect that is where most of those prisoners were indeed taken. So, Guyevo has fallen. The Russians have now reached it's not a village. Apparently, the Russians refer to it as a farmstead of Athleisure, which is right on the border. I don't believe it is in a village. I believe it's a farm complex, probably buildings created for a specific Soviet-era collective farm, which has probably been converted since the fall of the Soviet Union to some big agro-industrial setup or complex. You find places like that all over the Soviet Union. But anyway, a small group of apparently rather large buildings. The Ukrainians are still there. They're still trying to resist the Russians. There seems to be no conceivable logic or point to this, but that battle, one way or the other, is coming to an end. Much more interesting and really rather astonishing is what is taking place in another part, the other part of Kursk region, where the Ukrainians still retain a presence. That is the village of Gornal, which is located not far from another village in Kursk region, Plyokhovo, which the Russians captured many months ago, or recaptured many months ago. So we're talking about an area to the southwest of Suja. Well, this is a somewhat isolated village close to the border. It has taken the Russians more time to reach it, but a battle is apparently starting for this village, Gornal. The Russian military are saying that they have complete drone control of the supply roads. And there was a report in TASS today, TASS being, of course, the official Russian news agency, that the Ukrainian troops in Gornal, the village of Gornal, are demoralized and are trying to retreat and escape towards the border with Russia, all of which suggests that the battle for the village is likely to end fairly quickly. However, there is another place near to the village of Gornal where a completely different kind of battle is taking place. Now, near Gornal, some distance away, isolated, is a monastery, a Russian Orthodox monastery. And apparently, this is an active monastery, or was an active monastery, until the Ukrainian troops entered Kursk region. I'm not sure whether there are any monks still in there, whether they left when the Ukrainians arrived. But anyway, the monastery buildings are large and strong. There are pictures, I've seen pictures of them. These are the usual fortress-like buildings that you will often find in Orthodox monasteries created in Russia, built in Russia in the Middle Ages and in the Tsarist era, when monasteries actually often did double as fortresses. So, according to the Russians, there's around 300 Ukrainian troops located in this monastery, on the grounds, in the buildings of this monastery. And some of them are paratroopers, some of them are troops enlisted into the Ukrainian military, who are ex-convicts, who are prisoners taken out of the Ukrainian prison system. They agreed to serve in the Ukrainian military as volunteers in return for their freedom. In some sort of ways, a similar deal to the one that Prigozhin and the Wagner group used to make. At one time, they too were recruiting very heavily in Russian prisons. Now, I have to say that the information I've obtained is that Prigozhin, in the winter of 2022-2023, when the Wagner organization was attacking and eventually captured the town of Bakhmut, that he was throwing these prisoners into battle after they'd only received basically just a few days or weeks training. I get the sense that these prisoners that are serving with the Ukrainian military have received rather more training than the Wagner prisoners got from the Wagner organization and from Russia. So these are obviously rather tough and embittered people, but they have received some degree of military training. And alongside the paratroopers, they are holed up in this monastery. According to the Russians, 300 men altogether. Now, the Russians say that they have the monastery completely surrounded, that the roads are fully covered by their drones. They've released footage showing their commanders controlling the drones that are operating around the roads, that no supplies can leave the monastery, and that there is no escape from the monastery either, that any soldier or group of soldiers who tries to flee the monastery will be quickly tracked down and attacked by the drones and presumably killed. So, a couple of days ago, apparently negotiations began for the surrender of the Ukrainian troops in the monastery. The Russians are keen to obtain control of the monastery without fighting, not just because it is always better to get the other side to surrender so as to avoid losses to your own side, but because obviously the monastery is a place of religious and, for all I know, cultural importance. And it seems that a senior officer of the paratroop forces stationed in the monastery, this is all according to the Russians, did enter into negotiations with the Russians, and he did work towards agreeing terms for surrender. And something went wrong. This is what the Russians say. And the Russians say that some of the troops, the Ukrainian troops in the monastery, refused to surrender and murdered this officer and some of his supporters amongst the Ukrainian troops holding out in the monastery. And if you read some of the Russian reports, it's fairly clear that they attribute this action to the work of some of the ex-prisoners. Well, perhaps one shouldn't devote too much time to the details. And of course, to stress again, this is all entirely a Russian account, but it does seem as if something like 300 Ukrainian troops, maybe that's an overstatement, but anyway, a body of Ukrainian troops are surrounded in this monastery. There's been dissension amongst them about whether to surrender or not. The more hardline group amongst them has prevailed and has managed to assert its authority by killing the officer who was trying to arrange terms of surrender. And it looks as if a battle is about to start in order to clear this group from the monastery, which will presumably mean a fight to the death, with the monastery building itself being destroyed. It's a very grisly end to the Kursk operation, Ukraine's Kursk operation. One wonders why, again, the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev doesn't communicate to the Ukrainian troops in the monastery and simply tell them to lay down their arms and surrender. I cannot see the logic of this battle, of holding on to this monastery in this kind of way, if it's intended to create some other great myth of Ukrainian heroism in battle. Well, I have to say that by this point in the war, I don't really see the value of those myths any longer. And anyway, whatever, the monastery is going to be destroyed. The men inside it are going to be destroyed as well. I've seen pictures now of very heavy Russian shelling of the monastery buildings. It looks as if the monastery is going to be completely destroyed and there's going to be very heavy loss of life. If Zelensky wants to spin a story of 300 Spartans, Ukrainian ex-convicts, holding out in a monastery in Russia against incalculable odds, well, maybe that will impress some people in the West. Maybe we can have films, Hollywood films in the future, providing us, with this whole story narrated in this particular way. But as far as I'm concerned, all you're getting are more dead people, a destroyed monastery, and all to no purpose at all. Anyway, there it is. So the Russians now soon going to recapture Gornal. Probably the monastery is going to be destroyed. Olyesha is likely to be destroyed. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, large numbers of Russian troops are now active in Sumy region. It looks as if the Russians are closing in on the key villages lying to the north of the town of Sumy. I get the sense that Ukrainian resistance in this area is disorganized and that the Ukrainians are short of reserves. And all of this, as I discussed yesterday, could be preparatory to a big Russian offensive in the north, not just in Sumy region, but in Kharkiv region further south, and maybe in Chernigov region further north. an offensive which, if it's pressed strongly, could bring the Russians closer to the city of Kiev. Now, here I have to say something about an Iskander missile strike that took place on Sumy region yesterday, Palm Sunday, and which has attracted a huge amount of criticism and attention in the West. Now, this is a strike apparently by 2 Iskander missiles on a gathering in central Sumy city, and supposedly, or at least, in fact, I have no reason to doubt this, it struck a group of civilians who were engaging in some kind of, in religious ceremonies and gatherings connected with celebrations of Palm Sunday. Now, as an Orthodox Christian myself, I find that absolutely horrifying. But, again, I have to say a few things which are not intended to minimize this particular incident. The media in the West and the Ukrainian authorities have discussed this as an attack, a strike against defenseless civilians, another cruel and indiscriminate attack by the Russian military. Dozens of civilians were killed, including children, and I've even read in, I think it was the Daily Telegraph, that this was intended as a mockery by Russia of President Trump's peace efforts. The Russians are providing a completely different account. They are saying that this was absolutely a strike with 2 Iskander missiles. It targeted a meeting, a gathering of senior Ukrainian military officials. It suggested that this was the command group of Ukraine's forces in the town of Siversk. Quite what they were doing in Sumy, by the way, I'm not sure, but anyway, that's what the Russians say they were. The Russians say that 60 of them were killed. The Russians got information that this meeting was taking place, that 60 of them were killed, and that, in fact, it is the Ukrainians who are at fault because this meeting took place in the center of the city, far too close to civilians, that the Ukrainians were using the civilians as human shields. Now, I have been asked to comment about this incident, and I do so with very great reluctance. I'm going to say, for what it's worth, that I suspect that the Russians are closer to telling the truth than the Ukrainians are here. First of all, a number of Ukrainian commentators, including the Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya, who, as we know, is something of a dissident figure within the Ukrainian political system. Anyway, they appear to confirm that there was indeed a significant gathering of military officials at this, or close to this location, and that probably was the Russian target. So we have some apparent confirmation of this story from of the Russian account rather, from Ukrainian sources who I have in the past considered reliable. The second is that I cannot for the life of me see why the Russians would launch 2 very expensive, precision-guided Iskander-M missiles with the intention of killing civilians. It makes absolutely no sense to me. I am sure that the Russians thought they were aiming for a military target. Now, that's all I'm going to say, because I don't know the details, I don't know the full facts. logically and properly, there ought to be an investigation. But of course, there isn't going to be an investigation because we see that the media in the West and some people, by the way, on the Russian side, are simply accepting their own versions of events and are not really interested ever in finding out the truth. As I said, I think my own sense is that the Russians are more likely to be telling the truth than the Ukrainians are. But as I said, I wasn't there. I don't know. Now, it is the fact that there is this tendency, and it is much greater, by the way, in the West than it is on the Russian side, to just repeat these stories that, rather repeat these accounts of these incidents that really ultimately, in the end, dismays me. So I've no doubt that civilians were killed in this strike, and that was a terrible thing. And if they were worshippers attending a Christian religious celebration, that was terrible. But it is also terrible what has been done in other places. Now, for years, and this I know for a fact, there has been all kinds of attacks, for example, shelling attacks, missile attacks, rocket attacks on Donetsk city and other Russian-controlled cities or previously militia-controlled cities in Donbass. Now, to be clear, those attacks do not justify whatever it was that was done in Sumy city if that was a war crime. But if you're going to report the one, then please discuss the other. There's no doubt at all that those attacks in Donetsk took place. You've all seen programs, or many of you have seen programs, by Patrick Lancaster, who has been in Donetsk, who's appeared on videos for the Duran, in which he's discussed these incidents, this shelling and these missile strikes. You will never read about them in the Western media. Instead, whenever there is a reference to missile and shelling attacks on Russian-controlled cities, which kill civilians there, which is very rarely, by the way, it's always been sold as the Russians attacking their own people in order to set up the Ukrainians, claims which have always seemed to me as both cynical and absurd. And, well, we have, again, further examples of the way in which this kind of information management takes place. Now, there have been various claims by the Russians about war crimes committed during the period of the Ukrainian occupation of Kursk region. And there is some evidence which I cannot assess. I wasn't there, that some very, very terrible things were indeed done. The Financial Times today is carrying a long article about the fact that the people in Kursk region lived in hellish conditions. But it's the Russian authorities who are supposedly to blame for this. Though reading the article, I found it difficult to understand in what way exactly. Anyway, all of these incidents merit investigation. It could be that the Russians acted needlessly in this attack on Sumy. It could be that they are indeed to blame in some way. But simply using incidents like this to establish an atrocity narrative, I think, obscures far more than it informs. It reminds me of a passage in George Orwell's book, 1984, in which atrocity, which says that in the wars fought between the great powers, in that book, the same deeds were considered atrocities if perpetrated by the enemy, but were praised as either valiant deeds or completely covered up when carried out by the armed forces of the great power that was reporting them. Anyway, that is what I'm going to say. I don't want to return to this topic. I find doing so distressing and uncomfortable, and I think it obscures us from further understanding of the war. Donald Trump seems to have an instinctive understanding of this. He said that the attack was a mistake and he wasn't prepared to go further or to issue the kind of easy words of condemnation that people far too easily fall into. Anyway, let me move on. I will say this. These events in Kursk, Sumy region, on the border, only part of a larger war. Elsewhere, the pace of the Russian offensive has now been accelerating. Now, there's been a lot of reports about fighting south of Konstantinovka, the southern city of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Konstantinovka conurbation. The Russians seem to be gaining ground rapidly there, to the point where it's starting to look as if Ukrainian defenses in the area of Konstantinovka, including in the area around Toretsk city, north of Toretsk and also east and west of Toretsk, is actually collapsing. I think that we appear to be watching or seeing a Russian advance in force towards Konstantinovka from the south. In Chasiv Yar, the fighting continues, with the Ukrainians offering more resistance. But again, I get the sense that this may only be the case because the Ukrainian forces that have been defending in Chasiv Yar, men apparently drawn from the 24th Mechanized Infantry Brigade of the Ukrainian military, are mostly trapped in the extremely small high-rise building citadel area in the center of Chasiv Yar, so that since retreat is extremely difficult, they have no real option but to go on resisting. So a major collapse appears to be underway in that area. But perhaps an even more alarming development for the Ukrainians is what is now starting to happen around Pokrovsk, which is this other place, this other town in Donbass, I think, apart from the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Konstantinovka conurbation. Pokrovsk is now the only other sizable town under Ukrainian control in Donetsk that is left. Anyway, I've already discussed how Pokrovsk seems to be in a semicircle, with the Russians now in strong positions to the south, west, and east of Pokrovsk. Now, in the area to the west of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians conducted major counterattacks, trying to push the Russians back in the area of the villages of Kotlino, Shevchenko, and Pishanye. It looks as if all of those counterattacks were repelled. Film has now appeared which shows clearly the Russians in control of at least some, I suspect all of Kotlino. I suspect the Russians were never pushed out of Kotlino at all at any time during the various Ukrainian counterattacks, which began in February. So it seems to me that the Russian forces to the southwest of Pokrovsk are stably holding their positions. But perhaps much more alarming for the Ukrainians is the fact that the Russians now appear to be launching what is increasingly looking like a significant advance, even an offensive, in the area north of the village of Vozvyzhenka, which is located to the east of Pokrovsk and south of the main Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka road. Now, it does look as if the Russians have crossed the road and occupied parts of the road north of Vozvyzhenka. I discussed this some weeks ago. But the main advance appears to be happening to the to the northeast of Vozvyzhenka, east of the road, which swings northwards beyond a certain point. And here it looks as if the Russians are now starting to advance fairly rapidly. They're also advancing rapidly north from places like the village of Arkhangelskoye, which they captured. It's north of Ocheretino. Again, they captured that, as I remember, during the fighting last spring. And, well, the effect is to turn the semicircle round Pokrovsk into what increasingly looks like a pincer movement around Pokrovsk, that the Russians are advancing strongly to the east and north of Pokrovsk in a way that looks calculated to cut off Ukrainian supplies to Pokrovsk from the north, even as one suspects that eventually, when the Russians start advancing, resume their advance from Kotlino and perhaps some positions west of Kotlino, they'll be able to cut off Ukrainian supplies to Pokrovsk from the west as well. All of this, to me, points to a potential advance on Pokrovsk at some point within the next few weeks. It's very typical of the way the Russians conduct operations against urban areas. They don't immediately attack and try to storm them. They did do that in the early stages of the war, in the battles of Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And they did this to a certain extent during the Battle of Bakhmut and the Battle of Avdiivka even. But mostly, their objective seems to be to try to create a kind of semicircle round a town, cut off the main communications lines, increase pressure on the garrison to the point where it is obliged to retreat. And this was the tactic that was used against Selidovo and Novogrodivka and Kurahovo, and it was very successful. It meant that these places basically fell to the Russians intact, with none of the devastation that one used to see in urban areas from earlier battles. So, for all I know, that's the fate that is now awaiting Pokrovsk. We shall see. In the case of Konstantinovka, I can't see myself how that kind of strategy can work. Konstantinovka is too interconnected with the urban concentration that is Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka to be encircled in quite that same way. But then if we come back to Konstantinovka, with Toretsk and Chasiv Yar under Russian control, the Russians hold the high ground, and it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians anyway to mount an effective resistance in Konstantinovka either. Now, all of this is making me wonder whether my initial assumption that the main Russian advance was towards the Dnieper is correct. It could be that the main axis of the Russian advance will be towards these cities over the course of the spring and summer, that the Russians will aim to basically bring all of Donbass finally under Russian control and to storm the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk, and that will be the major Russian objective over the next couple of weeks. Now, I received a very, very interesting email from a member of the Duran community, whom I am not going to identify. Obviously, it was a private email. But he did make an important point in that email, a point which I have made many times, that what has slowed down the Russians up to now, quite apart from the enormous amount of assistance that Ukraine has received from the West, the enormous supplies of weaponry, of artillery shells, of drone technology, of all of those things, not to mention Western involvement in planning and provision of intelligence and all of that. But the single other factor which has slowed the Russians down, and is one I've talked about many times, is the topography of Donbass. The fact that you're talking about a densely built up region made up of basically factories and industrial areas and urban sprawl, all of which blends in, every part of which blends into the other. It's like a sort of web, of a steel web of towns, villages, small towns, villages, industrial villages, railway lines, which obviously are important for communications and for logistics, but which are also natural defensive barriers because they are raised above the ground soil. Railways, forested zones, small rivers and streams, all of which makes rapid advance through this area, provided it is defended, extremely difficult. And of course, Donbass has been very strongly defended by Ukraine, and Ukraine has had years to build up and plan its fortified positions in Donbass. And as I remember an American official once confirming, military official once confirming, they had a great deal of advice and help about how to do it from the US military, even before formal aid from the United States began. So this is a complex battle to win. But if I'm right, if Pokrovsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka do come under Russian control over the next few months, then the Russians will have moved beyond it. They will have finally escaped the steel spider's web of towns, villages, factories, roads, embankments, rivers, which has made up the Donbass. And they will be in open country when movement becomes much easier. And of course, at this point, it's perhaps worth adding that if movement becomes easier, if forces are able to move rapidly over distances, then drone warfare of the sort that we have seen starts to become more difficult. I've discussed how The Russians and the Ukrainians appear to have quite different philosophies in terms of drone warfare. The Ukrainians mostly use their drones, principally use their drones, to attack Russian positions on the front lines, whereas the Russians mostly use their drones in order to destroy vehicles, lorries and trucks carrying supplies to the Ukrainian forces on the front lines. The Ukrainian tactic of using drones to stop Russian advances, however, breaks down if those advances happen in multiple places over long distances and start to take place quickly. Now, that is not a thought original to myself. It has been made to me by various people, and I've also seen it set out in an open source somewhere, which I don't remember now. But it could be that over the next few months, quite apart from the limitations that we see in drones anyway, their effectiveness is going to decline, even as the Russian advance gradually begins to pick up speed. Now, saying all of this, I'm going to repeat again, it could be that the Russian leadership has more complex and ambitious plans than the ones I know. But it could be also, as this member of the community who emailed me has suggested, that the Russians have also evolved their strategy. And just as happened in the Second World War in 1944, when the Russians ended their practice of attacking in one direction at a time, they're going to start attacking in multiple directions at the same time, increasing the pressure on the Ukrainians to the point where the Ukrainians aren't able to resist. The Russian forces are perhaps now strong enough to do that, whereas they had not been earlier in the war. So it could be that all of the things I've just discussed, an attack and a plan to capture the towns of Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and Konstantinovka is indeed going to happen, but that it will be combined with another offensive towards the Donbass, towards the Dnieper, to reach the Dnieper and perhaps reach Zaporozhye. And who knows, maybe a third offensive, which some people are increasingly talking about, to break the Ukrainians in northeastern Ukraine and to bring the Russian army again to the gates of Kiev. I don't know. I don't know how big the resources that the Russians have at their disposal actually are, but if this is their plan, it wouldn't surprise me. Now, is anybody in Washington thinking about this? If the Russians are indeed thinking in this kind of way, which they might be, and the tone that I am getting from Russian commentaries and Russian reports is increasingly self-confident. If that is true, if this is what the Russians are thinking, then US military officers, British military officers, who are still stuck in the stalemate narrative, at some point over the next couple of weeks and months, are going to get a profound shock. Now, I say that because all of this is, of course, going to have an impact on the way in which the diplomacy is conducted from this point going forward. Now, on the Duran and in these programs, Alex Christoforou and I have discussed several times how there are clearly two distinct factions within the Trump administration. One faction, what you might call the neocon light faction, Rubio perhaps, Waltz, Kellogg definitely Kellogg, still want to take a hard line against the Russians. They are unable to acknowledge the prospect of defeat in Ukraine. They have persuaded themselves that the war is in stalemate. They want to impose a peace on the Russians, very different from the peace that the Russians themselves envisage. They basically are thinking of a frozen conflict whereby the Russians retain physical occupation of the territory that they currently occupy, but where this is not recognized by the United States or by the Western powers, whereby a settlement whereby European peacekeepers enter Western Ukraine. General Kellogg is now openly siding with Macron and Starmer about this. It is clear that Starmer and Macron, in coming up with this plan to send European peacekeepers to Ukraine, have been coordinating with Kellogg and probably with other senior US officials, like perhaps Mike Waltz and perhaps Secretary Rubio as well. I mean, I don't know for a fact about the last two, but it seems likely. So there's that faction. And then there's the other faction, Witkoff and the others who support him, who I don't know, to say it straightforwardly, who they are, but who do apparently represent a sizable faction within the administration, who have a much more realistic understanding of the situation and who understand that the war is indeed being lost and that the United States needs to cut its losses and pull out whilst it still can. Anyway, if we have this big offensive by the Russians, and even if only some of the things that I've discussed happen, if the Russians, for example, capture Konstantinovka and perhaps Pokrovsk, even if, say, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are still under Ukrainian control and the Russians are still some distance from the Dnieper, well, that will have a big effect. It will perhaps even create a crisis within the decision-making processes in Washington, and it will certainly lead to a major crisis in Brussels, in NATO and in the EU, with a panic that Ukraine is indeed going down and is losing the war, a panic of which we saw the first signs this time last year after the fall of Avdiivka. But this time it will be a panic on a much, much bigger scale. And then the question is, on which side will the administration eventually go? Will it decide to go back to the policy of trying to support Ukraine? Will the voices that say that Ukraine is in a desperate condition, that it is about to collapse, that allowing Ukraine to collapse will simply give the Russians and the Chinese a big geopolitical victory, that the United States needs to pull out all the stops to stop that happening? A line that I fully predict we will hear increasingly from people like Kellogg. Will that line prevail, or will the more realistic view associated with people like Witkoff, will that prevail instead? Will they say, we need to cut this investment? The fact that these defeats are now accumulating means that we can't go on supporting Ukraine in the way that we have done. It's time to pull out. Now, I say that. I don't know quite which way things will go. But I do remember that in the 1970s, when the United States faced a similar dilemma in the first weeks and months of 1975, as it became increasingly clear that North Vietnam was heading towards a military victory and South Vietnam was heading towards collapse. It was the voices that spoke out against further involvement, the more realist voices, that prevailed. And I sense that left to himself, it would be those more realist voices that the president would probably prefer to listen to. Today, Donald Trump downplayed the attack on Sumi, or he didn't exactly downplay it. He said that it was a mistake. He conspicuously refused to join in the game of criticizing the Russians, taking a different line from his peace envoy, so-called peace envoy, at least envoy to Ukraine, who was, of course, Keith Kellogg, who said that the attack on the people in Sumi crossed a line. So we can see that there is a significant difference between Trump and Kellogg, a visible difference in response to this particular incident of a sort that I've not seen between them before. And that might be significant. And Trump has also spoken again about how he's confident that events are going to move forward towards some kind of peace agreement. And he seems to be going out of his way for the moment to put the blame for any lack of movement at least as much on Ukraine as on Russia. So my sense is that Trump's instincts in the event of the kind of crisis that I'm describing will be to stay out. He has also spoken about how the conflict is nothing to do with him, that it was Joe Biden's war, not his war, that it would never have happened if he had been president in 2021 and 2022, about which, by the way, I think he is almost certainly right, but that's my view. And again, I have to say, those words look like a further attempt by Trump to distance himself from what I suspect he senses is now a losing proposition, indeed a debacle. But there is going to be a difference from what happened in the 70s. In the case of Vietnam, those who supported some kind of re-engagement with South Vietnam, some kind of intervention on South Vietnam's behalf, a resumption of military aid to South Vietnam, perhaps even a renewal of bombing against North Vietnam and against the North Vietnamese army. They were to be found mostly within the administration, within the executive branch. The cause for restraint, by contrast, the ones which ultimately prevailed, came from Congress. Today, it seems to me to be almost exactly the other way round. There are hardliners in the administration. Kellogg, as I said, looks to me to be one. But the point about those hardliners is that they are at least matched and perhaps overmatched by more realistic people within the administration supporting Witkoff. By contrast, I get the sense that despite the rise of the MAGA movement within the Republican Party, there is still a significant clear majority in Congress that remains committed to support for Ukraine. Probably that is true. In fact, definitely that is true in the Senate. At least 25 Republican senators, half the Republican caucus, look to be diehard Ukraine supporters, and of course the Democrats in Congress overwhelmingly are. But I suspect it's also true in the House. The Republicans have a majority in the House, but a very small one, and the Democrats are united in supporting Ukraine. And I'm sure that there are some Republicans in the House who also support Ukraine, so that they, together with the Democrats, would certainly form a majority, and I'm guessing a big one. Now, it's important to remember that in the United States, whatever the enormous powers that the president wields might be, ultimate legislative authority comes from Congress. And if Congress insists on the president intervening strongly on Ukraine's side in the event of a military crisis, I think it's going to be very difficult. It is going to require all of the president's political skills and all of the MAGA movement uniting to support him to see that off. So anyway, we shall see where this goes, but it seems to me that everything is very finely balanced at the moment. Now, turning back to Witkoff and his meetings with Dmitriev and Putin in St. Petersburg, one thing is absolutely clear to me, and that is reading commentaries, which is that there are quite a few Russian business people who would be very, very open indeed to a resumption of economic links with American business circles. I don't want to suggest that they are the majority, and I don't want to suggest that these people have any very great degree of political influence, because I don't, frankly, believe that they do. But if the United States were to pursue instead a rapprochement, if we were to see a full resumption in diplomatic contacts between the United States and Russia, if the Americans were indeed to adopt or even embrace the offers of economic cooperation that Putin and Dmitriev have presented to them, well, I think they would find lots of enthusiastic partners in Russia. That's all I will say. I think that there remain significant elements within the Russian business community that would be very, very happy indeed to resume economic cooperation with business partners in the United States. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's what I'm going to say about Ukraine at the moment. And fascinating situation starting to evolve on the military fronts. And the president, perhaps after hearing what Witkoff had to say, when Witkoff returned to Washington, seeming to lean towards Witkoff's side. Before I go on Ukraine, can I just say that Trump did, of course, renew the 2021 sanctions that Joe Biden imposed a few days ago. These were sanctions, by the way, that Biden imposed on Russia prior to the start of the special military operation. The Russians are completely unfazed by this. Peskov, who was Putin's spokesman, says that they expected it. They didn't imagine that at this time the Americans, Trump, would be providing much in the way of sanctions relief. And I said that some Russian businessmen look forward to cooperation with the United States. But judging by the speech that Putin gave to the industrialists on the 18th of March, he doesn't expect that will happen. And the vast majority of industrialists fully agreed with him and appear to be supporting him. Anyway, that's what I will say about the Ukraine conflict for the moment. Now, there was another meeting directly after Witkoff finished with his meeting with Putin. He flew to Oman, and he didn't actually directly meet the Iranians there. He had discussions with an Iranian delegation led by the Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Arakchi. Arakchi was in a separate room from Witkoff. The Omani foreign minister apparently was conveying messages between the two. But the meeting was very positive, apparently. Certainly the Iranians are claiming that it was, and that significant progress was made. And Witkoff is saying the same. And after the discussions ended, Arakchi and Witkoff actually had a brief personal meeting, and apparently the mood altogether was good. Now, it's not difficult, again, to see what the contours of an agreement between Iran and the United States at this time might be. The Iranians are ready, apparently, to cease uranium enrichment above a certain level, which they would need for their scientific reactor. Presumably, they're prepared to hand over their uranium stockpile to some third party, maybe Russia, as happened in 2015. The Iranians will not give up their ballistic missile program or ballistic missiles. They will not abandon their friends in their Hezbollah and Houthi friends. They will not make changes to their political system. But probably they will agree that, unlike the case with the JCPOA in 2015, they will make a clear-cut commitment to abide by the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty indefinitely. In other words, they will accept that they will never be a nuclear power, something which they didn't exactly do when the 2015 JCPOA was agreed. As I recall, that agreement was limited to a period of 10 years, which is about to end, by the way, this autumn. So, Trump could come away from this agreement. He could say that he's got the Iranians to agree to give up once and for all their plans to obtain a nuclear weapon. I'm not saying, by the way, the Iranians do have plans to obtain a nuclear weapon. But Trump, would have come with a deal that was better than the original JCPOA. It would be indefinite, not time limited, in the way that the JCPOA was. And the Iranians will do that because, contrary to everything you read in the media, they're in a much stronger position than they were in 2015. They have strong economic links now with China. They have a strategic partnership agreement with Russia. The Russians have just ratified that strategic partnership agreement. Now, all of this should provide the grounds, the basis for an agreement between Iran and the United States. Again, it depends on Donald Trump, more than on any other individual, whether he will go down that particular pathway. I can see that there will be intense opposition in the United States, not to mention Israel, against doing any sort of deal with Iran. Again, the alternative of doing that deal, it seems to me, is to drift into war, and I cannot see how that works to the US advantage. I have discussed in this program different conflicts. One which the United States currently has with China. It is at the moment an economic war. There's another one that the United States has with Russia. The conflict is over Ukraine. And the third is the conflict that the United States has with Iran. If you take a step back, in each and every case, you can see the kind of deal that could be done to end the conflict. Moving away from the reciprocal tariffs with China, keeping tariffs at a certain level, but not just against China, but against all other countries. Emphasize that your objective is to protect US industry. Put aside the idea of inflicting some kind of economic defeat or geostrategic defeat on China. And then negotiate with the Chinese some longer-term relationship, which will result in a rebalancing of trade, which would be in the Chinese interest as well as the American one. And I suspect the Chinese would be up for that. You can see the kind of deal that might be done with the Russians. The United States closes down its failed operation in Ukraine, focuses on rebuilding economic links and political links with Russia. They would be mutually beneficial, both for Russia, but also for the United States, and they would free America's hands to deal with other things. And you could see the deal that can be done with Iran. A JCPOA revived, but strengthened, with a commitment by Iran that it be maintained indefinitely, and with Iran perhaps agreeing to more intrusive inspections and Russian guarantees on that Iran does not that Iran indeed does not move forward with a nuclear program at any point in the future. So you can see the deals. They are there. All they require is imagination and political will. I think the imagination is there. I think people like Witkoff, Trump himself at times, maybe other officials, Vance, for example, I don't know. They have that imagination to see that. The question is the political will to do it there? Does there exist sufficient backing for these agreements in the United States to move forward and to secure them? If not, and I suspect if there isn't the will for the one, there won't be the will for the others. We're going to see the United States drift into confrontation with China, Russia, and Iran, probably all at the same time. And, well, the outlook then, as I said, is extremely grim. It all depends on the decisions that are going to be made in Washington over the next few months. I doubt that there is much time. Anyway, this is my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget that if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.